Hello, and welcome to the Field Guides. I'm Steve, and I'm here with Bill. Good morning, Bill.
Good morning, Steve.
What we're going to do today, and over the course of many future episodes, is give you the experience of what it's like to be out in the field, in the woods, and on the trail. Each episode, we pick a natural history topic, research that topic, take you out to a natural area, and share with you everything we learned. But this episode is going to be a little bit different because we're here with Erik Danielson, who is the Stewardship Coordinator with the Western NY Land Conservancy. So,
welcome, Erik.
Yeah, welcome.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you guys.
So what we're going to do today is Erik is going to be taking us through a property that the Western NY Land Conservancy is working on acquiring, an area called the Allegany
Wildlands.
I want to make sure I get that right.
It's very complicated. Yeah.
Tough to remember. And like the previous episode we did with the Western NY Land Conservancy, we're going to be combining topics here because we're going to be talking about the Land Conservancy, the property that's here, but then we're also going to be talking about a specific species that we're definitely going to see, right, Erik?
We absolutely are going to see them.
Okay, so we will see the American chestnut because a lot of times we go out to sites and we don't find our target species.
Those are fun episodes.
Yeah.
The last time, did we find bryozoans or no? I don't think we did. We just talked about it.
Yeah, I don't think we did, yeah.
But we will see the American chestnut today.
Yeah, and it was very nice of the Land Conservancy to say that they'll cover any of our medical expenses if we end up loaded with ticks. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Those nonprofits, they're loaded.
Yeah, It's very generous.
So, Erik, why don't you give us a little bit of your background, just to give the audience a sense of how you got to your position as Stewardship Coordinator.
Hi, folks. At this point, Bill asked Erik to tell us about his background. Erik told us about growing up in Western New York, working with the New York City Compost Project on Staten Island, linking up with a nonprofit called Wild Metro that aligned with his growing interest in reliably measuring tree height, and eventually moving back to Western New York, where he was able to meet Priscilla Titus, a senior ecologist with the Western NY Land Conservancy, and her husband, Dr. Jonathan Titus, an associate professor in biology at SUNY Fredonia. These two mentored Erik and helped him out with some opportunities with the Western NY Land Conservancy, where he eventually was hired on as a full-time employee as the Stewardship Coordinator. Unfortunately, we had a lot of cars going by in the background and got off topic a few times, making this section a nightmare to edit. So I'm circumventing the editing process with this post-production narration. So we'll pick up again with two short clips that should have been edited out of the episode, and we'll immediately move on to talking about what it is the Western NY Land Conservancy does.
Why don't you say it again?
Okay.
Third time's
These cars.
You know, oversized pickup trucks with muck tires on all year are part of the natural fauna of this
area.
Yeah.
What's that stick that foresters use? What's it called?
The Biltmore stick.
The Biltmore stick.
Biltmore stick.
Have you
Yes,
heard of that?
we don't use those.
That's old-fashioned?
They've got their applications.
Okay.
But
You use the Danielson stick, right?
I think maybe that should be edited out. That's going in territory where. Anyways,
I wasn't going there.
This episode's going to get real blue real fast.
Oh dear.
No.
I think this is a good spot to just let the audience know what the Western NY Land Conservancy is all about. So I think we already mentioned that we did an episode previously with the Land Conservancy, and we talked about land conservancies then, but I think it's good to do it here too for any new listeners out there. So the Land Conservancy, anybody that's listening, they may have a similar organization in their area, but it may be called a land trust, right?
Yeah.
And these are private nonprofit groups that are dedicated to conserving land, not necessarily just wildlands, right? It could be culturally significant areas, it could be agricultural areas. Basically making sure land isn't turned into subdivisions or shopping centers, things like that, right?
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong with this, though, but isn't there something where you can get like a tax break if you say that you're not going to develop your land or commit to not?
That's what I was going to jump into next, because you use the term easement.
Yeah.
And in my experience, most people don't know what a conservation easement is.
That's a very good point.
Right? And I think it's so important for people to know, because I feel like an easement is such an effective and important tool for land conservation, and especially to groups who may see tree huggers as they're coming to try to take our land. Mm-hmm. And I feel like conservation easements is a way like, look, this land can still be in private hands, or it can still be productive in the sense of human production, but it can be conserved, it can be a benefit to the landowner, where it's almost like everybody's can be happy. And it frustrates me that easements are so ubiquitous. I feel like they're being used a lot, but it's almost like it's under the radar of the general public, where most people, when you say conservation easement, they may have a vague notion of what it is, but they almost think of like it's an easement, like letting someone's driveway through your property or something like that. You know?
Right, exactly. And I do occasionally get that when I'm trying to explain what an easement is. It's like, oh, well, that's like my neighbor's driveway that goes through the edge of my property. Right. But yes, Steve, you're right that part of this is that if you say you're going to not develop your land, you can get a tax break, but it's of course a little more complicated than that, because you don't just call up the government and say, hey,
Uncle Sam can suck it.
I'm gonna just kind of leave that chunk of my land alone. Can you give me a break on my taxes?
Right.
Work that way.
Right.
They want some details, and they want some accountability.
And wouldn't you agree that the land has to have some kind of specific conservation value or historical value? Just because you have some land you're not using doesn't mean you're going to get a conservation easement on it.
Right. To qualify for, or to be worth putting a conservation easement on a piece of land, it generally does need to have what the IRS defines as conservation values. Right. So if you look in the language of a conservation easement, there will be a section detailing what the conservation values of the land are. And the purpose of the easement is it is a legal document in which all parties agree that those conservation values are not going to be infringed upon or degraded by any of the parties involved. So, for example, for a farmland conservation easement, we have identified as conservation values things like open space and prime agricultural soils. You know, agricultural soils are very important to making sure that we can continue to feed ourselves into the future. We are not losing population, but we are losing land.
Right.
We're losing land to development projects and commercial projects, sometimes industrial developments that can make a lot of money for people in the short term especially, but, you know, you can't exactly take a housing development on prime agricultural soils and turn that back into productive farmland. So even though there may be a profit motive to turning that land into a housing development in the short term, if we're thinking in the long term, that's maybe not desirable. And that's where things like conservation easements come in, to ensure that that profit motive is not the only thing on the table determining what happens to that land going into the future.
And conservation easement, the way it was explained to me long ago, was if you think of someone as a landowner, they have property rights, and you can think of that as a bundle of sticks. And each stick is something they can do with their property. Mineral rights, logging rights, water rights, the right to farm, whatever. And when you enter into a conservation easement, you're giving up or giving away some of those sticks. So you may be giving away the right to develop the land. But you're still keeping all the other rights. So correct me if I'm wrong, but when the Western New York Land Conservancy enters into a conservation easement with a farmer, that land is not now open to the public unless the farmer decides that as part of his conservation easement. Like maybe he's going to allow hikers to hike through a portion of the land or something. But that's part of the setting up of the agreement, right?
Right.
So you have some easements on property that are closed to the public. They're still technically private land.
Oh, yes.
But that easement will be part of that property in perpetuity. So if they sell that land, whoever buys it is also buying the easement.
Right.
And can they opt out of it at some point?
I don't think so, right?
No, not really. I mean, there are clauses under which, an easement can be extinguished if certain things happen, but I've never had to deal with that, so I don't know a whole lot about it.
Right.
I will caveat again that, I'm only 4 weeks into this side of the operations.
I would say that in the research that I've done, because I used to teach about conservation easements when I taught environmental studies.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the literature refers to, like, all these agreements are in perpetuity. It's meant to extend, into the future, and it's not supposed to change. So I think those would be rare cases.
Yeah. I think that's something more like if something catastrophic happens,
right,
that such that the conservation values that were originally identified
right,
in that easement are no longer
there.
Yeah.
And that's, and from what I've seen, that's part of the deal if you want a tax break, because sometimes that is part of a conservation easement, not always, but you might get temporary or continual tax breaks on that property. But if those are going to happen, the deal needs to be for, the foreseeable future, for perpetuity.
Yeah.
Got it.
There are many different purposes for conservation easements in terms of what we're trying to produce as an outcome. Sometimes they are for, public preserves and recreation. Like when we preserve this property, the conservation easement will include stipulations for providing public access for recreation. But, some other ones that aren't necessarily open to the public have other purposes, like watershed protection, farmland protection, as we've been talking about, protecting rare and sensitive species and habitats that may not be compatible with a lot of public recreation on that property. So there are different purposes, and so different easement language for different situations.
Right. So I have a one-page primer on conservation easements that I'll post in the episode notes. I think I did for the last one, but I just kind of collected all basic information. And folks, if you're at all interested in conservation easements, check it out, because it is such an incredible tool. And I think that tool is one reason that land trusts like the Western New York Land Conservancy are doing such vital local work all across North America. I feel like, just like conservation easements, groups like yours, they're almost operating under the radar for the general public. They hear terms like a land trust and land conservancy and kind of have a vague notion of what it is, but you guys are doing so much great on-the-ground conservation work that's focused locally. There are thousands of land trusts across the country protecting hundreds of thousands of acres. I should have looked up the numbers, because I know I had it for our last episode, but it's amazing the work that you guys are doing. So thank you, and we're happy to spread the word about your general work. But let's talk about this property here. So folks, we're at what we call the Allegany Wildlands, right?
Right.
And we are close to Allegany State Park. Longtime listeners will recognize that name. The Allegany Nature Pilgrimage, we recorded an episode there a few years ago. But just to give everyone an idea of where we are geographically, just imagine the New York-Pennsylvania border. We are, what would you say, to the left of center. That border? No, that's not helpful. Steve shaking his head. All right, you do it better.
Let's talk about geography in terms of left and right.
If you were to stick Allegany State Park on the Pennsylvania-New York border, and picture where that is, we would in fact be left of Allegany State Park.
Right. I don't know if
you're
knows.
Treating north and south as forwards and backwards.
Right. Exactly.
Which is good geography for sure.
Yeah.
Right.
But we're on the New York PA border. We're about an hour and a half from Buffalo. South.
Oh, even longer if you get stuck behind a horse and buggy. And also people transporting their horses. We got to do an episode about banning all horses at this point.
Steve is anti-horse, apparently.
No, it was fine, but it was kind of shocking
will not
to
ingratiate you with the locals in this region.
Right.
We have a lot of horse trails here, and they contribute a lot to some of the local conservation.
I actually like how there's a deer crossing next 3 miles, but then it was like horse and buggy next 4 miles. Just signs that you don't really see around like Hamburg, where I live, and other places around me. But
stay alert while you're driving.
Yeah, right.
Do we need to say that Steve is totally kidding?
I'm kidding. Let's not ban. We don't need to ban horses.
Steve loves horses.
I do have a professor that would say, "Yeah, let's ban horses."
Really?
I think Joe.
Oh, Joe Allen?
Yeah, Joe Allen might. Yeah. He thinks they destroy trails, but yeah, especially out west, I think.
But he knows a lot about out west.
Yeah.
But here, let's focus on this particular project. So tell us about this property, what the Land Conservancy is trying to do here. But why don't we walk a little bit so we get a little bit away from the road, and you can kind of fill us in as we walk.
Sounds like a good plan.
Cool.
I'm gonna grab my banana.
Oh, son of a gun.
We're going to have to change that, I think.
You mean you're not going to include both the Daniel stick line and grabbing of the banana?
Guys, we can censor it. We'll just beep it out.
Okay.
I'm just going to grab my It's not necessarily an
Better.
improvement.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to be eating while you walk. So.
I mean, I think.
If I'm eating while I walk, I just have trouble talking.
Honestly, a lot of people like that stuff.
Okay, that's true. That's true.
Just an ASMR. We get as close as we can to the chewing.
All right.
We ate on episode
Definitely
1.
People like my girlfriend will not be able to listen to the episode.
Right,
There's
right.
chewing
Sound of
happening?
Chewing.
All right.
Oh, yeah. I'm more towards that side than the eating side, but yeah.
All right, let's go. It's going to be a tough one.
Damn it. Man, it's like you can't get far enough away.
You know what we should do? I'm just going to say this. At the end of the episode, we should stand by the road,
Uh-huh.
and you can record a bunch of cars going by, because you can always put those in almost as like background noise
I guess.
to drown out the transition.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you could
Yeah.
create another track, and
We can do that.
Sneaky.
sometimes when you have too much disturbance, you can put in more disturbance, and it
Right.
hides it. So
Makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. So we are now, actually, we moved a little bit. We are standing by a nice little babbling brook a little further into the property. And so a little bit about this property. In context, the significance of this property is it's the first piece in a larger project called the Western NY Wildway.
We should have just set up some cones about a mile down the road, blocking it off.
Having both the Western NY Wildway project and the Allegany Wildlands project has been a little bit confusing sometimes in terms of terminology. This property that we're at is about 200 acres. It's where we were describing down near Allegany State Park, and that is the Allegany Wildlands project. So that's where we are now, and it's part of the Western NY. See, it's even confusing when I'm trying to say it. Part of the Western NY Wildway project. So, the Western NY Wildway is a large-scale landscape conservation project that will link protected lands all through Western New York and hook it into a larger network of protected lands called the Eastern Wildway that spans the entire eastern United States. The purpose of this is to create corridors of connectivity where habitats are connected rather than being entirely fragmented and isolated in ways that prevent wildlife, even including plants over long time scales, from being able to move, particularly with relation to our changing climate and environment. So the Allegany Wildlands is our first property in this larger Wildway project.
So I think this is super exciting, because I had actually talked to Jay Jean about this a while back. Jay Jean is the Deputy Executive Director,
Yes.
I have that right? Of the Western NY Land Conservancy. He's who we had on the podcast previously. But I talked to them about this idea. I mean, in ecology in North America and really globally over the past few decades, forest fragmentation and habitat fragmentation, habitat loss, those two things are inextricably tied, has become one of the major drivers of species extinction. And we have all these wonderful parks, national parks, state parks, but research just keeps showing us that it's not enough. These islands of habitat, we need to have connectivity. If we are going to even try to hold back species extinction, let alone turn it around. And I just think it's so exciting that you guys are focusing on this on a local level. And I'd encourage listeners, we're going to post links to the Land Conservancy in this particular project, but I'll also post other links to the Wildlands project, which is a continent-wide effort to develop wildways. Go ahead.
Well, that would be the Wildway project. This is the Wildlands project.
Correct. Thank you for correcting me.
Like I said, we've had some little mix-ups due to the similarity of the two terms.
Right.
But
it's all about
definitely,
connectivity.
If you've got links to the Eastern Wildway project,
Yeah.
listeners, no matter where they are, if they are in the eastern U.S., and there are probably similar projects being developed elsewhere.
There's one called the A to A project, trying to connect Algonquin to the Adirondacks.
Okay.
So Algonquin
So
in
be a
Ontario,
similar scale.
yeah, trying to create wildlands connecting those two important areas.
Cool. So the significance of this particular property, the Allegany Wildlands, and why it fits well into our Wildway concept is that it is directly connected and contiguous to well over 1,000 acres of existing protected land. It's sort of a mosaic of the South Valley State Forest, some county forest land, Cattaraugus County.
These are areas in southern Western New York.
Right.
Okay.
It's also contiguous to the Allegany Reservoir Wildlife Management Area, and then sort of geographically contiguous, if you count water, directly across the reservoir is Allegany State Park. So it's connected to a pretty big chunk of existing protected habitat. At the same time, the shape of the property, you could sort of picture a rectangular strip going down a hillside, and so there's more forest land above it, up on top of the hill, and there's forest land and wetland habitat down below it at the valley bottom. And the importance of this property is that it connects those two, because a lot of the development that's happening right in this area happens in these middle slopes. So when there's development of, say, housing, estates, sometimes industrial projects like wind turbines, things like that, those are mainly in the middle slopes, and because of that, they kind of cut off that connection for wildlife movement between the hilltop areas, which are mostly working forests, mostly private land, and those protected wetland and forest habitats that are in the valley bottoms. So protecting a habitat like this ensures that some of those places maintain connectivity and allow wildlife to continue moving back and forth between those habitats seasonally.
And this is, as you were saying, this is one piece. The Allegany Wildlands is just one piece in a patchwork, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're trying to basically connect, if we take Western New York, the southern border of Western New York, to the Niagara Peninsula going into Canada, right?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, so to give wildlife, any kind of wildlife, traveling from Pennsylvania up into Canada or over Lake Ontario, places to move.
At the broader scale, yes.
Yeah, the broad scale. I just think that's a beautiful thing. In this property here, the Western New York Land Conservancy, you're seeking to buy this outright, not just have a conservation easement. It's not going to still be private land, right?
Right. This is one that we're buying to own.
Okay.
Much like the College Lodge that we spoke about previously, and about 20 of our other preserves. And once we are able to buy it, it will become a nature preserve with public access, trails. It will be open to the public.
But it will have a conservation easement on it.
Correct.
So if, God forbid, something happens to the Western New York Land Conservancy, right?
It's still protected
Yeah.
in perpetuity,
Right.
as you said.
Right.
Good
And
word.
In cases where we are the property owner, usually the easement is held fully or in part by some government agency. Typically one of the agencies that's helped us fund the project through a grant. So I think probably
Department
in
of
this
Defense?
case. There's always the Department of Defense, those good old defense folks.
Not in this case.
More often the Parks and Recreation or U.S. Fish and Wildlife agencies like that.
Yeah. So beyond the connectivity that this property provides, what are some of the key aspects of this property in terms of wildlife that are worth talking about?
So this is really where it gets into the stuff that I really like, because working with easements and stewardship is cool, but I am absolutely a plant and wildlife nerd, especially the plants. So apologies if I do go on a little bit about
You're
leafy
with
things
two
that don't
plant
move.
nerds here.
Yeah.
Right. So one of the things that's really cool about this little chunk of southwestern New York State is that it was never covered by glaciers during the last ice age. The formal name for this unglaciated area is called the Salamanca Re-entrant. And when I was growing up, I basically learned that Allegany State Park was the only part of New York State that had never been covered by glaciers during the last ice age. And oftentimes I'll see that referenced as basically being the full extent of it. It's just Allegany State Park. But in getting ready for this project, I looked into some mapping and found that the size of the Salamanca Re-entrant is actually quite a bit bigger. It extends a bit further west, a bit further north, and quite a bit further east, such that Allegany State Park only represents about 40% of the total unglaciated area. So it's still not like a huge area, but it's meaningful and significant. So the fact that the glaciers never covered it during the last ice age means that it has soils that developed in place over very long-term erosion of the bedrock that is native to the site.
That's 6,000 years, right?
I'm just kidding. Oh, I get you. Yes, 6,000 years after the waters receded, and
that's right.
Yes.
After the flood.
Right.
Trying to confuse the listeners.
Yeah,
sorry,
so 6,000
I
plus
couldn't
another
resist.
6,000 plus another 6,000, and we get to the height of the last ice age, about 18,000 years ago. And, the ice would have been really close. If we were standing right here, or maybe more like standing on the hilltop behind us, we'd probably have been able to look north and see like a 2-mile tall wall of ice. The glacier advancing edge. I don't know if it was 2 miles thick at the advancing edge,
but it was thick.
Right.
It was 2 miles thick elsewhere.
Picture the wall in Game of Thrones.
There you go.
Honestly, our listeners might be more familiar with glaciers than Game of Thrones. Sometimes it's hard to tell. But.
Well, if you picture the glacier as a bulldozer,
that's a good way to do it.
Yeah.
The glacier, extended south over the period of glaciation, and as it did so, it was basically due to the accumulation of more ice and snow mass up sort of in the main dome that was over kind of northern North America, and that created pressure that pushed the ice south, as I understand it.
That's got to be good for plant communities. No.
Well, just like bulldozers, which we also know are great for plant communities. I mean, sometimes, they're doing that, southern grassland restoration, and it turns out all you got to do is, scrape the top layer of soil that's got all that invasive stuff out, and seed bank comes back up.
Whoa.
But the glaciers are a much bigger bulldozer that has not the sensitivity to just scrape a couple centimeters of soil away. They gouge huge amounts of soil and bedrock underneath out of the land as they advance. So in the glaciated portion of New York State, which is the rest of New York State, the vast majority of it, all of the soils are soils that were basically ground up from bedrock somewhere further north, moved south by the glacier, and then dropped there as the glaciers eventually retreated and melted away. With some remixing, you've got these interesting, meltwater features, which we don't really have to get into because today we're talking about the unglaciated portion of New York State. But just know that glacial geology is really cool and has a big influence on what plant communities exist in what places. So that's a lot of fun. But the soils here are formed entirely by the long-term erosion by both precipitation and chemical weathering in the soil biology of the bedrock that is on the site. And because of that, if you look at a topographic, not necessarily a topographic map, but like a 3D topographic view like you'd get in the terrain mode in Google Earth or something, you can see that the landscape here has much sharper slopes and ridges. It looks like it's just really like you could use it as some sort of an abrasive if you needed to get rid of a callus on your foot. I don't know.
You got it.
Yes, it's very, very wrinkly in a very sharp way.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. We're in the really the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains.
Right, yeah. Well, and I mean, the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, in a sense, go all the way up to the edge of the Allegany Plateau.
Right.
But this portion of the Allegany Plateau is a lot more physically rugged because it was not smushed down and smoothed out by the glaciers.
Right. It wasn't sanded.
Right. It didn't get bulldozed.
Yeah.
Sanded, bulldozed. We're making all kinds of
I know.
analogies here.
Geologists out there are shuddering.
Yeah. Well, so the cool thing about that is that the bedrock here, it's mainly kind of neutral to acidic siltstones, shales, sandstones. There's a big sandstone layer that creates these kind of cool rock city sites that you might have heard of.
Such as Rock City.
Right, like Rock City, Jake's Rocks, Panama Rocks.
Little Rock City.
Yeah.
Right.
These are all places in New York.
Yes. But, those are places, there's a lot of places like those further south, too, where you've got these, what look like giant boulders, like whole cities of giant boulders that have these narrow passageways in between them, and usually flat tops, and those are formed by, repeated freezing and thawing of water that gets into cracks and kind of breaks things up, as opposed to up in the glaciated portion where I grew up. If you find a giant boulder, that's something that a glacier dropped there. So different
erratic
processes. Oftentimes granite, yeah.
No, I was going to say an erratic, right?
Oh, and erratic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought you said granite. Sometimes they're granite.
Sure.
That's the only time you'll see granite in that part of Western New York, because otherwise the geology is entirely sedimentary. But like I was saying, the geology here, the bedrock that all this soil is weathered from, is really kind of more on the neutral to acidic side, and pH is something that's really important to what plants grow in a given place. But a lot of the plants that I see here are plants that would be considered sort of rich site plants, which means that they're associated with high levels of calcium and slightly alkaline or more neutral soils. So that's sort of an odd conundrum, but has had me sort of wondering about whether the very, very long-term development of the soil biology here means that there's enhanced nutrient availability in ways that takes longer to develop in more recent and younger soils. But I don't know if there's anything to that. It's just kind of one of the things that makes me wonder.
Okay.
Alternatively, it could be that, for example, during the previous ice age, the Illinoisan glacier, the last one, the most recent one, was the Wisconsin glacier, or Wisconsinian, I don't know. Geologists can grumble at me. And then prior to that, we had another ice age, or another glaciation. That was the Illinoisan glacier. And to my understanding, portions of that extended a little further south into this unglaciated zone, and so might have deposited some other sediments here that may be interacting with the soils here. So interesting questions. I don't have good answers, but I enjoy seeing the results.
Right. I guess that is important just to bring up briefly, is that there's glacial and interglacial periods. So when you say unglaciated, you mean unglaciated since the last glacial period.
Right.
Because not necessarily every glacial period didn't cover it, but
we're in an interglacial period now.
Right.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, this would be a lot different if we weren't.
But I guess the
Maybe.
comparison that I'm drawing there when I say that there's plants here that are associated with more kind of rich site conditions is as compared to across the reservoir in Allegany State Park, which is sort of the bulk of the unglaciated zone. Some of the plants that I see here, even though it's a similar unglaciated habitat, are different than the plants I see over there. Some of which are really interesting, uncommon, even rare species that would be really cool to find in Allegany State Park, but I've never heard of them being recorded there.
It just sort of dawned on me that because this is one of the areas that wasn't covered in glaciers during the last glacial period, that this area, and then probably other areas around it, were kind of like the ancestral lands of a lot of the plants that eventually recolonized the more northern areas, correct? I mean,
Refugium.
This would be a refugium, correct? So
I love that word.
Possibly.
Because I know they could have come from other areas as well, how they spread, but this could be one of the sources for the genetic diversity that we see in the northern areas now that used to be covered.
Definitely a contributor.
Yeah. I mean, of course, we're in just one little spot, but,
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's we're gonna definitely get back into glacial refugia and how plants migrated north after the Ice Age as we talk more about our target species. But yeah, there would have been ecology from here that spread further north into the areas as the ice retreated, probably kind of first. But there's good reason to believe that at the time of maximum glaciation, these areas just south of the glacier edge would have been dramatically different in terms of their floristic composition.
That's a good point.
The climate was so
Oh
different.
yeah, that's a good point. So they must probably even further south, you would imagine.
Further south, but maybe even those would have a head start the closer they were to this. Yeah,
So Steve was wrong.
No,
not 100%.
It's a good point though that it's not like the glacier stops and suddenly it's the same communities. It's obviously going to be a very different type of environment there and climate and everything.
Yeah.
But that is one of the interesting things towards the end of the glacial period that I was running into as I was doing a little research for this episode, is that the warming up of the planet in general and the retreating of the ice were not perfectly synchronous. That's a huge amount of ice. Just because it gets warmer doesn't mean it's going to melt all right away. Yeah. There's some lag time. So there were periods towards the end of the glaciation in which there was much warmer, more temperate vegetation up very close to the ice, and even some periods where, especially in localized areas, the ice re-advanced and would have been right up against more temperate biomes, especially where there were like lobes that kind of pushed south in a skinny sort of way. So definitely complicated, and there probably would have been times when the vegetation here was very like tundra-like maybe, but also might have been periods in which there was like a temperate mixed forest pretty close to some glaciation.
All right, so speaking of plants, why don't we, since I'm thinking about our time here, why don't we take a moment now and focus on our target species, the American chestnut, because you said off mic that we were close to one?
Yeah.
Okay.
But before we do that, I just want to talk for a moment about slightly more recent history. Okay. Glaciers are deep time, obviously, but more recently, when European settlers came into this area, the folks who bought this piece of property were a family called the Slugas, and the Slugas have owned this piece of property ever since then. So nearly 200 years, maybe a little more than 200 years.
Wow.
I'm not sure. But it's been in one family for this entire time. And the road that we're on, it's sort of a very overgrown lane through the forest, is a logging road that's probably been used time and time again, because while the topography is very rugged and it wasn't any good for farming on the majority of the property, they did regularly do some timber harvesting. So this forest has always remained a forest, but it's been regularly harvested for timber. There is a small portion of the property near the road that was cleared and used as farmland for some period, maybe just as pasture. I'm not sure how good the soils would have been for crops. And there's a little old homestead, that kind of thing, that are sort of just fading into the woods. So it is the Slugas that we are working with to purchase the property. Originally they had it on the market, but once we were interested in it, they decided that they wanted to give us an opportunity to conserve the property and that they would like to see it in conservation. So that is why they've given us an opportunity to raise the money that we need to purchase the property and, set up the funding to permanently pay taxes on and maintain the property in perpetuity by the end of this year. So we are working on raising roughly $870,000 by the end of this year. And most recently we announced that we have received a challenge gift of $310,000 from 3 separate donors.
Wow.
And since it's a challenge gift, that means we need to match the funds with donations and other sources. So anyone who wants to contribute or knows someone who might be able to contribute to help make sure this property does get conserved successfully, definitely have a look at our website. We have all the information there on how to make donations, all of our contact info, and we'd really appreciate it.
And that's WNYLC.org, right?
Right.
Okay.
WNYLC.org.
And we'll make sure to put links in our episode notes as well.
We will. But
Yeah.
for anyone too lazy to go to our episode notes, they can just type in WNYLC.org.
And that's Western New York Land Conservancy. That's an initialism right there. Very easy.
All right, so folks, we do encourage everyone, and we'll say it again at the end of the episode, but we can't say enough how much we think this project is important to the long-term ecological health of Western New York. Just this piece and then the larger Wildway project in general. Great work.
Thanks. So yeah, let's go see a chestnut.
All right.
Cool. I hope it's healthy.
Now, why would that be, Steve? Are they susceptible to the coronavirus?
You know what? I never even thought about it, but I'm thinking they might be at this point.
So right here we have the first one that you can find on the property. And looking up, we're seeing, these spreading branches over the trail that are maybe 20 feet above our heads that have these big leaves. They're very long and they're very sharply toothed on the sides.
Yeah, it looks like an aggressive American beech.
I was just thinking that, yeah. Looks like a badass beech leaf.
Which, they're family members, right?
That's right, they
in
are.
the Fagaceae, so
Okay.
Yep, along with the oaks, they
Yeah.
are all closely related.
they're frenemies, the oaks. Yeah.
Yes, the oaks unfortunately harbor their enemy.
Oh, they do?
Yeah.
It turns out that scarlet oak in particular is kind of the ideal asymptomatic host for the blight fungus.
Wow.
But I believe the other red oaks in particular do kind of host it as well.
Okay.
And that's why even after you have all of the chestnuts in an area die, that fungal organism can hang around and it doesn't disappear.
So the oaks are like a reservoir for the...
Right, that's definitely the word I was looking
Oh,
for.
wow.
Do we have scarlet oak here? When I was in Illinois, we would see it a lot, but here I don't really see scarlet oak very often, or I don't even remember it if I ever really saw it. But
Around here, you probably haven't.
Yeah.
There really isn't. There are some very small, limited populations kind of in the Niagara area, and then you kind of get more of it over in the Finger Lakes in central New York. It likes very sandy, well-drained soils, and the dominant soils of this region don't really do a lot of that. But we have northern red oak here, we have black oak. Black oak is also regionally very uncommon. There's a lot less of it than I think people necessarily think there is, because it's easy to pick up a field guide of trees and see that black oak has rougher bark than northern red oak. And usually they'll show a picture of a shade leaf of black oak that's sort of very kite-shaped. And so then you go out into the woods and you're seeing northern red oaks. And then you're also seeing some trees that look like northern red oaks, but their bark is very rough. And you can see that the leaves up above your head that are down low in the canopy, they're very kite-shaped. And so then you think it's a black oak. But it's just an older northern red oak. Oaks have extremely variable leaf shape, and that can be very confusing.
right.
But this is one of the sites where there's really distinct and clear black oak, which has a very different bark texture when you see it that way.
Just for people, so it's funny, I really don't think about the oaks sometimes in terms of like the common names, but would you give the scientific names too?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, of course, the tree that we are looking at now, American chestnut, is Castanea dentata. Dentata, referring to those sharp teeth along the leaves. Red oak is Quercus rubra, rubra referring to red, which probably is an allusion to the red coloration on the petioles, the leaf stems. Quercus coccinea would be scarlet oak, and I'm not sure what coccinea means, but it's often in the names of things that are bright red. So I'm assuming that has to do with another kind of redness. And then Quercus velutina, that's black oak. And the velutina, sort of like velvet, I don't know if that's actually the root, but refers to hairiness. It has hairs in places the other oaks don't. It's...
All right, cut.
So in my research, I just found that Castanea just meant chestnut.
Yeah.
Yeah, like there was a...
Well, okay,
Greek.
but when you get words like that, sometimes it's like Greek for the tree or the chestnut,
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. Those are always confusing to me.
Well, we can just say that that's as far as we traced the Adirondack.
Right.
Right, because those words tend to come from something else usually, even
True.
more. But
So let's give people a sense, though, of the American chestnut and a little bit of its history.
Sure.
So I did some research on that. Steve, why don't you start with the research you did?
silence for
Crickets.
yeah. I got nothing. So
That's okay.
Yeah.
You're holding them.
It's okay.
yeah,
He's doing the heavy lifting. He's going to do the editing.
literally the heavy. Oh well, I was gonna say the heavy lifting.
And you're holding the mic.
Yeah.
All right, so it was interesting because when we first got here and we were talking, you said that you were going to be dispelling some of the common held myths about the American chestnut. So I'm interested to see what those are because we love when that happens, right?
Uh-huh.
So
The seed pods aren't really dead baby porcupines.
You know,
They-
that's not what I encountered in my research, to be honest with you.
They're actually just
the American chestnut's actually doing just fine, right? I wish. All right,
If only
so
that were the myth.
the chestnut used to line the streets in Western New York.
no, those were elms.
Damn it! Didn't we did have a lot of chestnuts though, didn't we?
Not along the streets.
No, not along the streets. Damn it! The only thing that I didn't
Steve,
research, I got wrong anyway.
Don't try. Okay. All right. So what I found was that its range stretched from Maine to Georgia and West Indiana, and in the late 1800s, before the blight really hit, and we're going to get into the blight and what it's all about. But it's estimated that there were about 4 billion trees in its native range. Now, what does that mean, right? But this is one point that I'm wondering if you're going to debunk. I often heard, over the past decades, when people would talk about the chestnut, they would say that in some of the forests in the Appalachian Mountains, kind of its real home range, that 1 in 4 trees in the forest could have been American chestnut. But then in the research I did for this episode, I even found some records that it said in some places it went up to 50% of the forest was made up of American chestnut. Just to give a sense of what a large component of the Appalachian forest it was.
Mhm.
Now, in your experience, is that accurate?
Well, the version you just gave is definitely the most sober version of that sentiment that I've encountered.
Okay.
Because a lot of times what I actually read is just accounts that say that, American chestnut was outright at least 1/4 of the composition of all the eastern U.S. forests, which then sometimes goes even a little bit more hyperbolic into,
Our whole forest is...
in 1600, a squirrel could have run across the tops of chestnut trees from the East Coast to the Atlantic.
Right.
Now, I want to point out...
Wait, you mean the Mississippi to the Atlantic? You said East Coast to the Atlantic.
Yeah, I did mean the Mississippi. Back then the Mississippi was the
That's
Atlantic.
right.
Yeah.
I love that these stories are getting mixed.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and, you hear the same thing said about white pine.
Right.
In different contexts, like maybe 100 years earlier. And then you also just get that story in the first place disassociated from a particular species of the squirrel running from the coast to the river, which is probably not even true in most of the eastern U.S. because there were grasslands.
Right.
As we're learning more and more about.
Shout out to our Grassland Birds episode.
Yeah. But, this far north, grasslands were a much smaller part of the habitat matrix. So, maybe a squirrel could have made it from the Atlantic to the Allegany without having to meander too far. But they would not have done it strictly on the tops of chestnuts or white pines by any means. You were correct in identifying that it really is the Appalachians that is sort of the key portion of the range for the American chestnut. When you go to the really old accounts of what trees were present in eastern North America, they tend to emphasize the oaks. They tend to emphasize beech a lot of the time. And when they mention chestnut, they usually talk about chestnut being on slopes and mountains. And when we look at the preferred growing conditions for American chestnut, that really backs that up. It likes acidic, moist but well-drained soils that are often sandy or gravelly. So that is to say that it has a particular niche, and while it's very competitive and very adaptable, if you have a fairly stable forest system over a long period of time, there will probably be certain areas where you do find a lot of it, and other areas where you don't find as much of it. It was certainly described as being present in other forest types as a minor component, but especially when you get into habitats that might have a more calcareous soil, as in full of calcium, you'd probably have a lot less chestnut.
But those areas of the Appalachians you talked about, it would be a lot more prevalent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you've got those slopes, and you do have pretty reliable reports from pretty reliable reporters back then of the spectacle of the chestnut flowers.
Right.
When just a whole slope would be covered in these chestnut flowers.
Yeah, it was referenced in one thing I read that it was like the hillside was covered in. It looked like it was covered in snow.
Yeah.
Because there were so many flowers.
Oh.
So I just want people to think about, though, that large component, some areas where it could be 25 to 50% of the forest trees, what that did to the ecology of those places, like the amount of mast that those trees would produce and how that impacted the wildlife there. There were some things that I came across where some people were saying that it's possible the loss of the American chestnut exacerbated the decline of the passenger pigeon.
That is something I've
because passenger pigeons fed so heavily on American chestnuts. So I came across a paragraph that I want to share, that I want to read for the audience. And this is from the Finger Lakes Land Trust, so another land conservancy. I don't know if these are your allies or your enemies. I don't know.
I think we're friends.
Okay. So when you meet, you don't snap your fingers and engage in knife fights like West Side Story?
Not yet.
Okay. All right, so this is what, from one of their newsletters I came across. Talking about the American chestnut. The so-called redwood of the East was a keystone species, and its loss in the second half of the 19th century changed the forests irreparably. It grew to a giant size, 100 feet high, 4 to 5 feet in diameter. I hate this. Road noise.
That's such an odd thing for them to write.
It was weird. No, it's ruining the
It
the
timed
moment.
out perfectly with that car going by. It was amazing.
And it's spreading branches through the forest floor below into deep shade. Untold caterpillars ate the leaves. The sturdy branches supported massive flocks of passenger pigeons, and the large, abundant, starchy nuts fed bear, white-tailed deer, and wild turkey. Even in death, the tree shaped its environment. The fast-decaying leaves leached their nutrients into soil and streams, while the rot-resistant branches fell into the water and created hiding places for fish. It was a source of food and medicine for both Native Americans and European settlers, and the latter fed its nuts and sprouts to their livestock. The bark was used for tanning leather. The straight, strong wood made everything from musical instruments to log cabins to railroad ties and caskets. And in my research, I kept coming across people referring to this as a cradle-to-grave tree, because they said it helped the settlers with creating things, from everything from cradles to coffins and everything in between. You read accounts of people going chestnutting in the late 1800s, where people could gather buckets of chestnuts and sell them. We already talked about it being covered in snow during the flowering season. It looked like the mountains were covered in snow. And one thing that I wanted to focus on was the rot resistance of the wood. Now, we're on the western side of Allegany State Park, but on the eastern side near Olean, have you been to Pfeiffer Nature Center?
That is one of those places where for some reason
You just haven't made it to. So Pfeiffer Nature Center, they have a cabin there that belonged to the family that owned the property originally, but that cabin is made out of chestnut boards that I believe were harvested from trees that had actually fallen.
That's my understanding.
But it's so resistant to rot that they were able to take those fallen trees, create lumber out of them, and turn it into a cabin.
It's actually still quite sought after by woodworkers.
Sure.
They'll find, the decaying snags, which term, if listeners aren't familiar, a snag is just a dead tree that's still standing as it decays. And you find these chestnut snags that, their bark is gone and the sapwood, the outer layer of wood, is gone, but the heartwood is still there. And oftentimes you can get nice solid sections of wood, and woodworkers, particularly wood turners, seek those out.
Right.
They also often get them from very old fences, because those fence posts especially the ones that are up off the ground, they're 100, 150 years old fence posts, but they're still sound enough to use for woodwork.
Yeah, it's crazy. 100 years later, and it's still
Wow.
workable. It's nuts.
Yeah. Well, that rot resistance and all those other incredible uses for the wood, I think is important to point out as the source of that term, the redwood of the East. So as far as anyone can tell, that seems to have been coined in early American Chestnut Foundation literature, that term, the redwood of the East. But I think it's often been misinterpreted when people hear it as referring more to their great size
Gotcha.
in the forest.
Yeah, they didn't get as big as redwoods.
Right, they didn't get as big as redwoods, but there has been a bit of an issue with historic photos of American chestnuts included in museums, websites, things like that, are often in fact images of redwoods being logged on the West Coast.
Wow.
And this is usually not actually that hard to discern if you understand what you're looking at, because redwoods have this very thick, dark bark, then this very thin layer of white sapwood, and then this really dark heartwood. So usually it will be a picture where they've like cut a wedge into the tree because they're in the process of logging it, and there will be like two guys on either side and a couple guys lying down in the wedge cut.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's pretty easy to discern once you understand the differences in like the physical anatomy of these trees, that what you're looking at is in fact a West Coast conifer and not a chestnut. But those images are rampantly peppered throughout the literature. I know there are no more that I've been able to find on the American Chestnut Foundation website. They've done a good job of cleaning that up.
Good.
But yeah, there are some amazing historic photos of actual chestnuts. You just have to dig for them a little bit harder some of the time.
Okay. Yeah. So let's talk about the blight.
The blight.
Yeah.
Yes. So, as many interesting, do I want to say bad things do?
Let's talk in terms of good and bad.
Grand Island.
Yeah.
Grand Island.
So there's
Long
good
Island.
fungus and bad fungus. And
There's no morality in nature.
Maybe we want to start that over.
Yeah.
so there's this bad insect.
All right. So let's talk about the blight.
Right. So, in the very early 20th century, I think maybe it was 1904.
Very good.
Okay.
Yeah, I have it in my notes here.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, and I want to give a shout out to, there's this very, very nice little book that was published recently that was the only book on chestnut that I could get fast enough to read before this episode this week, because it is available as an ebook, and all the other good-looking books are not available as ebooks, which is a bummer. But yeah, I should have written down who it was written by, but it's the only ebook on American chestnut you can find. And it's,
Please tell me that's the title of it.
you're gonna have to put it in the show notes.
We can do
that. Yeah.
Yeah, that'll be fine.
No, it's very basic. It's written at definitely like a middle schooler could read it. And so, it's all very simplified, but it's a very nice summary. And I think, would be really good for pretty much all ages to introduce them to the subject if they want a little bit more of a narrative version of what happened with the chestnut blight. But yeah, in 1904, as I understand it, it was a guy who worked at what was then the zoological park in New York City.
The Bronx Zoo.
The Bronx Zoo, yep. And so he noticed that the chestnut trees were getting sick. They were starting to get some discoloration on the trunk that started sprouting little orange things, and the branches up above were dying, and eventually this discoloration would spread all the way around the whole trunk, and the tree would just die entirely. And so that concerned him. So he got in touch with someone who was working at, I think, the New York Botanical Garden at the time, plant pathologist. And so they were able to figure out that it was a fungus that was attacking the trees, eating through their cambium layer, which is the portion of the inner bark between the tree's wood and its outer bark where growth happens. And basically dissolving that cambium layer with a chemical called oxalic acid which is the stuff that makes certain vegetables taste tangy, but in much larger quantities is very caustic. And so with that oxalic acid, they break down and digest the plant tissue in the cambium, and they do that all the way around the trunk, and that causes the tree to be unable to send nutrients back and forth between the roots and the leaves, and then the tree dies.
So like a fungal girdling
Yes.
of the tree. Yeah.
And the research that I did backs up everything you just said. And the one thing that I wasn't aware of was that apparently before 1904, but I guess it makes perfect sense, there were these blips in state pathology reports of botanical diseases. In the late 1800s, pathologists noticing, hey, something's going on with chestnut trees. But it wasn't until 1904, like you talked about at the zoo, where someone said, all right, we need to take this. And then in 1905 was when they demonstrated inoculating a healthy tree with the fungal pathogen. They think it came in on Japanese chestnuts. I mean, because you guys know the late 1800s, that was like the botanical heyday. People were just so into botany then, and churches would have botanical walks on Sundays. But there was a lot of importation of exotic species. And back then we didn't know about invasive species or what could happen, the long-term effects. So we think it was brought in on a Japanese chestnut. And I've had people in talking about chestnut trees saying, what about Chinese and Japanese chestnuts? They're immune to the disease or they're immune to the blight, so why aren't American chestnuts? And in preparation for this episode, I listened to 2 In Defense of Plants episodes, another podcast with our friend Matt. We've talked about him a lot, but we'll put those in the episode notes. And one of the researchers that he brought on, I thought they couched it very well. They said, well, think about when European settlers came over to America. All these diseases that they had resistance to, the Native Americans had never been exposed to.
Wait, why is that? Because like the Native Americans are humans and the Europeans are humans, and how could one be immune and the other one not be immune? I don't get it.
It's all about exposure, man. Coevolution, right?
Oh my gosh. It actually makes a lot of sense.
It does make a lot of sense. Well, but didn't the Indians, didn't they come over from Europe, right?
Oh dear. You've been watching too many YouTube videos.
Hey, that's where I get all my information. So they hadn't co-evolved, just like the American chestnut tree had not co-evolved with this disease. And I think it's super important to point out, one thing that I didn't really realize, I guess I hadn't thought about it too much, but the Chinese and the Japanese chestnut, they're not immune to the disease.
Right.
They're resistant to it. So it's not like they don't get it. And one of the things the researchers talked about is trees don't have an immune system. Very often when they're facing a disease or a fungal pathogen like the blight, they form a callus, growing over and basically compartmentalizing the disease. Now, had you guys heard of tyloses? I hadn't heard of these before.
No, I haven't.
About this. So they're balloon-like swellings or projections that fill the vessels so they can no longer conduct water, and that's how they basically block off the disease. They compartmentalize it. Depending on your species, they form in different parts of the vascular system. You were talking about the cambium. And they can also form in response to wounding. Like I know when I tap a maple tree, that within a year or so, there's an area around that tap that's going to quote-unquote die. And that's the tree forming using tyloses, basically to shut that off, to block off the wound. So trees are fighting off disease all the time, and if they have certain genetic resistance, they can, the disease isn't going to go through the tree so quickly that the tree can't mount a defense.
Right.
So the Chinese and the Japanese chestnut, they can mount a defense and kind of block off the disease. But with the American chestnut with no resistance, the fungus was just so virulent that by 1940, so this was, first documented, given a scientific name.
It's a long
I wouldn't
one.
expect you to know this one.
Fungal scientific names, they're always extra fun.
Cryphonectria parasitica.
You
That's
practiced.
I did.
Yeah.
And there was a newer one.
Well,
But-
I want to mention that Nectria bit. It's
Yeah.
probably fairly closely related to some of our other fungal pathogens like beech bark disease, which is a Nectria, or it might be a revised genus name by now. A lot of our...
Also attacks vascular system.
Yeah, a lot of our tree fungal parasites, both native to this continent and introduced, are in that same group, which tend to have nectria attached to the name somewhere.
Yeah. So that's really what allowed the disease to be so virulent, is it had no resistance. Now that's the point I was talking about before, though, is that, so this was identified in 1905, given a scientific name. By 1940, just 35 years later, most of the mature American chestnuts were dead. I mean, so it just moved so quickly through the population.
So by 1940, you wouldn't find a single chestnut on the streets of Buffalo.
Lining the streets
of Buffalo. I mean, I don't know if you'd find it
still at Elms back then.
Yeah, right. I was gonna say I don't know if you'd find it before then, but you would definitely not find it after
Definitely
then.
not after.
Okay, folks. So that's where we're gonna end part 1 of our episode with Erik Danielson, the Stewardship Coordinator with the Western New York Land Conservancy. Stay tuned for part 2, which should already be released by the time you're hearing this message. So thanks for listening, and we'll thank our sponsor, patrons, and reviewers at the end of part 2.
And by the way, there were no ticks to be seen. The Land Conservancy didn't have to cover any medical expenses. What a relief!